welcome everybody. We are very glad to see everybody here this morning. I know that this has been a difficult few weeks for those of us who have been following the war in Ukraine, and we are very pleased to be able to continue to bring you some excellent speakers that will look at various aspects of the war situation and what the impacts are both to the United States and to global security. So before I introduce my speakers today, let me just give you a preface that our next program in this series will be on the 19th of May, and it will be a presentation on how money laundering is being used by various entities to avoid the sanctions on Russia, and what the U.S. response can be about the situation. The presentation will be by Dr. Maury Rayson from the Monterey Institute of International Studies. So please join us for that. The announcement for that talk will go out by the end of this week. We are also looking to set up our next in-person event, which will be held in mid-June. We are looking for to finalize the speakers and the date, so I'll be sending that out. And we will hold that at Montreux, at the Montreux Clubhouse. And the focus of that will be on energy security and how we make the transition, both in Nevada and in the country, off of fossil fuels in the future, and what the war impacts may be on our ability to transition our energy supplies. So please stay tuned to that. I know a lot of you are very interested in coming back in person, for those of you that are still located in Northern Nevada. In addition, I am thrilled that we are conducting our 2022 Youth Security Forum on the 24th of May. So we will be hosting that, or Reno High will be hosting that event. We will be engaging with about 200 students from Reno High from the history and government classes. And the focus of that will be on navigating the war in Ukraine as they go out into the world and look at careers as policy leaders and informed citizens. And we have partnered with George Mason University to bring that event into the classroom in Reno High. So please stay tuned for announcements about that and for a follow-up on that. And the Reno High students are using these series, the Ukraine series, as their background information, and this is their required project for their AP government classes. So with that, let me get started right away so we can have plenty of time for excellent discussions today. Caitlin Welsh from the Center for Strategic and International Studies is our lead speaker today, and Bill Payne, Dean of the College of Agriculture at the University of Nevada, Reno, will be our discussant and following up on issues from his perspective. So with that, Caitlin, why don't you go ahead and get started?
Hi, everybody. I see we have about 30 participants, which is great. I'm Caitlin Welsh. I direct the Global Food Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. I've been with CSIS for a couple of years. I was with the U.S. government for over a decade before then, but I am not from the Washington region. I'm from the Great Lakes region of the U.S. And it's really important to me to speak to audiences outside of the Beltway. I like to do as much activity with my hometown as possible. So I really like to accept invitations like the one that Marian extended. So I'm very, very pleased to be speaking with your organization today, because I think that the information that we produce is important and very important for us to discuss it with audiences outside the Beltway. So thank you very, very much for extending this invitation. And I'm very, very happy to be with your group today. A little bit of a background for me. I joined CSIS about 2 years ago. My first day on the job with CSIS was the first day of the lockdown. So it was I started working with CSIS from the kitchen table, and it was a long time before I was even in the office. I'm sure I'm not the only one in that situation. Before joining CSIS, again, I was with the U.S. government for over a decade, working on global food security policy from a number of vantage points. I was with the State Department for about 8 years in the State Department's Office of Global Food Security. So I worked on food security policy from that vantage point for a long time. I also have on-the-ground experience with a grant-making organization called the U.S. African Development Foundation. I was also a Peace Corps volunteer, so I have experience, again, even more experience on the ground. And when it comes to agriculture and food security. After my experience in the State Department, before joining CSIS, I was at the White House for about a year and a half, where I was the director of our G7 and G20 activities. And in that role, I actually dealt very little with food security. I dealt with all issues being discussed in the G7 and G20, representing the United States at 3 major summits. So have a variety of experience, a deep experience in food security, and a variety of experience on other issues, in addition to food security. But I'll back up to my first experiences with food security policy from when I joined the State Department in 2011, and that was on the heels of the last major global food security crisis, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, but that was in 2007 and 2008. When, for a variety of reasons, the price of some global commodities had doubled in a period of 4 years, but by 2007, 2008, because of a number of external factors, the prices of some commodities had doubled, which led to sudden price spikes in a number of food importing countries. And the issues that were at play at that time were depressions in food exports from a number of food exporting countries, concurrent droughts, and other climate change related events. At the same time, energy prices were high, and there are strong correlations between the prices of energy and the prices of food for a variety of reasons. And at the same time, in order to protect their domestic markets, a number of countries imposed food export bans. So for this confluence of events, again, food prices spiked around the world, and this brought attention back to food security and agricultural production when political attention hadn't been on this topic for decades. So it was a time of real return of attention to these issues and excitement around these issues. That's when I joined the State Department, and it was a time when, at the time, it was Secretary Clinton at the State Department and President Obama. Both were prioritizing attention to food security and nutrition. And then attention to food security waned. In Washington, there are issues that gain attention and attention can decrease. There are things that are just popular and then become less popular over time. So attention to food security decreased for a while until the COVID-19 pandemic hit. And that's where, at least in my experience, I saw another surge of attention to this topic. Because of the COVID pandemic, we will be seeing more information about this as data is analyzed, but COVID-19 may have brought the highest level of food insecurity around the world in at least 15 years and perhaps this entire century. The UN is again crunching data, and we'll get more clarity on that in the coming years. But the reasons for acute food insecurity because of the pandemic are different from the reasons that we experienced in the 2007-2008 crisis. Because of COVID-19, the main causes of food insecurity were lost jobs, lost wages, and lost remittances. So lost sources of income for people around the world. Of course, we experienced this in our own country, particularly those in low and middle income countries whose jobs required close contact with other individuals. It's those people who are affected worse, as their incomes were suppressed and they had a difficult time accessing food. On top of that, we saw supply chain disruptions having to do with the pandemic, which are lingering today. And as a result, a lot of countries who were able to do this relied on social safety nets to bolster food security for their populations. So just to put this in context, putting the food security crisis being caused by this war, putting in context of the last 2 crises that I have observed, the one in 2007, 2008, and the one caused by the COVID pandemic. So to the current crisis, which is at this point, I believe, just nine weeks old. We're about 9 weeks into this. It could be 10 weeks. I could be off on that, but all that to say, we're not very long into this at all. And I've been doing a fair amount of work on this topic because CSIS, where I work, is a national security and economics think tank, and this issue falls squarely at the intersection between national security and food security. We were one of the first entities to put out some writing on what would be the impacts of a war on global food security if a war were to happen. So we put that out in late January or early February, and have been using our platform to raise attention to the food security impacts of the war and also to present analysis. In March, in the middle of March, we actually hosted an event featuring the UN FAO, UN Food and Agriculture Organization, US Department of Agriculture, and Ukraine's Ministry of Agriculture. We were able to feature a Deputy Minister of Agriculture from Ukraine, to Zoom him into our event, to give us his analysis, Ukraine's analysis of their food security situation in the midst of the war. So I'm very pleased to be able to use our platform to present very important information to highlight individuals such as this Deputy Minister. So turning to this present crisis, reasons for the disruption are, of course, it is a wholly avoidable crisis due to a war of aggression. We were seeing reduced exports from the Black Sea region for, again, two main reasons. One is sanctions on Russia and Belarus. Comprehensive sanctions from the United States and others have so far exempted all of Russia's agriculture sector, in addition to other sectors, medical sector and others, from sanctions. Nonetheless, exports from agriculture exports from Russia are reduced because financial interactions with Russia require interactions with financial institutions that are sanctioned. So despite the fact that there are important exemptions to the agriculture sector, which I think remain important, and I do not think that Russia's agriculture sector should be sanctioned. Nonetheless, exports we're seeing reduced exports from that region in agriculture products and in fertilizer. Belarus is being targeted by sanctions from the United States and from the EU, particularly when it comes to its export of one particular fertilizer called potash. Exports from Ukraine are disrupted because Russia is targeting all aspects of agricultural production in Ukraine. This is in violation of the Geneva Conventions. We are analyzing satellite data, and we hope to be producing this soon, but we have not only reports on the ground, reports from social media, from major media outlets, but we have imagery showing Russia destroying food warehouses, targeting fields, destroying bridges, silos, warehouses near cities. It's intentional, and again, Russia is targeting all aspects of Ukraine's agricultural production. So that's the reason that we see reduced exports in agriculture products from Russia, from Ukraine. I mentioned that in one of the last major crises in 2007, 2008, three things were happening. We were seeing suppressed production of suppressed exports of food, higher energy prices, and export bans. We're seeing the same things today, in addition to an overlay of impacts on fertilizer exports, which is a really important factor in that affects the nature of this crisis and how we can deal with it. So I'll look at all these things. When it comes to the export of foods, you see that Russia and Ukraine are major exporters of a number of global agricultural commodities, grains and oil seeds primarily among them, which means that the amount of these products on global markets are decreasing and the prices are increasing. Again, you hear a lot about wheat in the news, of course, oil seeds as well, which is the main input to cooking oil. But it's not just the markets for these primary products that are being affected, it's other products that rely on these. So meat prices are being affected right now because maize, for example, which is a major export from Ukraine, is a source of, for Ukraine and Russia, is a source of animal feed. So as the cost of animal feed increases, the price of meat will ultimately increase. So you see secondary products being affected by this. We are seeing substitute products being affected as well. Sunflower oil is a major product of Ukraine. Ukraine produces about 50% of global exports of sunflower oil. Prices of sunflower oil have reached an all-time high, but it's not just sunflower oil that's being affected. It's other oils that are substitutes or that are being used as substitutes for sunflower oil. Soybean oil, canola oil, even olive oil the price of olive oil is spiking. So you have prices of primary products being affected, prices of products for which Ukraine's and Russia's exports are an input, like meat, being affected, prices of substitute products being affected. And the last thing is, because fertilizers are implicated in this crisis, the prices of, the nature of the response is also being colored. So, we'll hear, can't the United States make up for the shortfall by increasing the amount of wheat that we produce, because we're seeing, again, reduced exports from the Black Sea. So can't we make up for that? Not necessarily, because as fertilizer prices spike, farmers are making different choices in terms of what they what they're able to produce. In the United States, for example, USDA released a survey last month or so. They had surveyed farmers across the country to see what their planting plans are for this year. And they found that plans for planting soybeans had reached an all-time high. Soybeans are relatively fertilizer, they're not relatively fertilizer unintensive or less intensive in fertilizer use. Plans for planting wheat were at the 5th low across this entire century. So you see farmers in the United States planning to plant more crops that are less intensive in fertilizer use and less crops that are more intensive, just because they're considering the price of inputs. That's the impact in a high-income country like the United States. Impacts in low and middle income countries are different. We're seeing that farmers, a variety of impacts that we're seeing. In some cases, farmers are deciding to, or realizing that they need to use more precision application of fertilizer to make best use of the fertilizer that they have. If they simply can't access fertilizer, then their outputs are going to decrease, and which is only going to put further upward pressure on prices. Looking at the global impacts of all of this, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization releases food price indices. At the end of February, beginning of March, they released the March Global Food Price Index. It captured only a few days of the war, because the war was only a few days old as of the beginning of March. At that time, the UN Food Price Index had reached an all-time high, even with only a few days of the impacts of the war being accounted for. Last month, in the April Food Price Index that the FAO released, it was another a second all-time high. So it is reaching all-time highs 2 months in a row for all foods generally, and for a number of sub indices, including prices of grains, meats, and oil seeds, were reaching all-time highs according to the UN Food Price Index. Looking at the United States assessments, the U.S. Department of Agriculture releases a World Agriculture Supply and Demand Index once a month. As of the beginning of last month, 2 months in a row, it's estimated reduced exports overall from the Black Sea region. One thing that's really important to note is that the projections that we're seeing from the USDA and from others at this point have to do with exports of grains that were harvested previously and are ready for export right now. I have 3 layers of harvests in mind. One is the previous harvest for which exports are prepared, and those are harvests that are affected by targeting of silos, of ports, of ships, etc. So those are grains that are already harvested. Second harvest that I have in mind is a harvest that was planted last fall for harvest this coming spring and summer. And that's one where it's it's an open question, depending on farmers' access to inputs that they need to fertilizer, to their own equipment, et cetera, to actually reap the harvest that's in the ground right now, And it's also their own access to transportation to export this onto global markets. The third harvest that I have in mind is the harvest that will be planted this coming fall for harvest in 2023. That's a very open question depending on the nature and the nature of the war, the length of the war, where the war is geographically located within Ukraine. So again, there's 3 layers of harvest that I'm watching and watching the effects of the war on these harvests. The UN has estimated that in a worst case scenario, over 13 million more people around the world could be undernourished over the next 4 years because of the impacts of this war. So this will affect food security for people around the world, the extent of which again depends on the nature and extent of this war. And what we're seeing is we're seeing disruptions related to this, to these price increases in different ways around the world. In 2007, 2008, there were riots related to the prices of food in about 30 countries. Estimates vary depending on the source, but about 30 countries around the world. We are seeing protests and disruption in some places. In Peru, for example, there have been protests over high food prices related not just to this war, but certainly exacerbated by this war. These protests have turned violent. We've seen deaths in recent weeks. High food prices were a factor in dissatisfaction with the former prime minister in Pakistan, which again, one factor related to his ouster recently, and seeing other protests in Egypt, for example. So seeing some of this, not widespread yet at this point, but we're seeing some evidence around the world. And I think I'll stop here, turn it over to Bill, but I'll be happy to pick this up and answer questions that you have. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Caitlin. Before we jump into Bill's presentation, I have a quick question because you went past it very quickly at the very beginning. You said that Russian food shouldn't be sanctioned. Could you give a little bit more insight as to why you think Russian food and ag shouldn't be sanctioned in this process?
Yeah, exports of these products should not be sanctioned because of the global effect, because sanctioning exports of Russian agricultural products would further suppress the amounts of products on global markets, which would have impacts in low and middle income countries, impacts on supplies they can access and on prices. It would cause global food prices to spike even more. It would even further increase the UN's projections for the number of people who would be undernourished around the world. So it's because of the global impacts that the United States is not sanctioning Russia's agriculture sector, that food policy experts don't recommend sanctioning Russia's agriculture sector. It's very tricky, but because as Ukraine's agriculture sector is being targeted by Russia, Russia's exports are actually increasing and Russia is gaining from that. But because of the potential global impacts, that's why we're recommending not sanctioning. Excellent.
Thank you, Caitlin. I appreciate that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bill, and then we're going to come back and probably pull the thread on that answer and a few more related questions afterwards. So for everybody who's on from NSF, remember you can put your questions in the chat box or the Q&A box anytime.
Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, as the case may be. I am Bill Payne. I also, as the case with Caitlin, I began in the Peace Corps more than 40 years ago, and I spent a good year of time working overseas in food insecure countries. That includes 12 years living in sub-Saharan Africa and 2 in the Middle East. So I won't go through this, the resume, other than to say that in addition to that, mostly in dry countries, I do know something about wheat. So there have indeed been a number of disturbing headlines regarding the effect of war and other inflationary forces on food security. Thought it was interesting that Caitlin mentioned the recession of 2008. But again, we're seeing decade-high food prices. They're driving chaos throughout the world, and that includes in some of the most food insecure places. such as Africa, and I would include Northern Africa as well as Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, I think so wheat is truly a global commodity. And as the two graphs show here, Russia is by far the largest producer of wheat in the world. And that's why an embargo or sanction of its exports would have such a huge global effect. Ukraine is in 5th place, so it is also a huge importer. There are clear changes in global trade concerning wheat. We've always had Middle East, or at least for decades, the Middle East and North Africa as traditional leading importers of wheat, because they've been less and less able to produce enough for their own population due to water shortages, climate change, and their very quickly growing population. But the other thing that I've tried to show in the bottom right slide is that diets continue to change in the world. And so if you look at the green line for sub-Saharan Africa, you see that it is importing more and more and more and more wheat. And again, that's partially with the need to address its population needs, but also because of changing diet. Populations are urbanizing and they want more convenient fast food, things that are easy to prepare. And even in Southeast Asia, you can see that increase, which is sort of surprising because most of it has had a rice-based diet for so long. So from that last recession, and when I was spending a lot of time traveling the developing world, in particular sub-Saharan Africa, and also in Haiti, we know what happens when people can't afford a nutritious diet. I've shown some data here from Mali during the 2008 recession. So that caused food price hikes, and people couldn't afford nutritious food. We started seeing stunting, wasting, and underweight children. Diets shifted to less expensive but less nutritious ones in an effort to keep stomachs full. One that you might have heard about is the Haitian mud cakes, where mothers who couldn't afford nutritious diets, but they wanted their children to have this a feeling of a full stomach, if you will, would actually mix mud and salt and other ingredients to make this cake. Protein and micronutrient-rich foods such as meat and eggs by poor families are sold rather than consumed. In other words, they take something that costs a lot of money and they sell it so they can buy grain or other cheaper foods. Again, with a view towards keeping children having the feeling of being full as they go to school or get up and work, whatever. We know that nutritionally will have severe implications for immune system and cognitive development in those children. So, and now as we learn more and more about epigenetics, it'll probably have effects on their children as well. So it really is a crisis. I said I knew something about wheat. The gentleman on the left won in the 1880s at the World Fair the prize for the best shock of wheat in the world. That wheat was actually, so that was just a few miles, that was going a few miles where my farm was in Western Oregon. And look how tall it is. That was actually a Russian variety called Kharkov. It's tall, late, it tended to lodge, it had low in response, and it was susceptible to a number of diseases. The Pendleton station where I worked as a dryland systems agronomist had modern wheat varieties, and I've shown some of them here with a former postdoc. But they're early, they're dwarf, they have strong stalks, they're disease resistant, and they strongly respond to fertilizer. The gentleman who is lauded for changing this, for changing that structure of wheat, if you will, was Norm Borlaug, and he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970 for his contribution to world peace through increasing food supply. He's known as the father of the Green Revolution, and they calculate he saved over 1 billion lives. But what people oftentimes don't know is that he wrote and spoke extensively on the linkages between food security, political stability, and peace, some of the themes that Caitlin was just touching upon. Norm was very worried towards his last, I knew him personally and was the research director for one of his institutes at Texas A&M. Towards the end of his life, the end of his career, he was very worried about this UG9090 in stem rust. And this is a disease that was initially found in Uganda, and there was no genetic resistance for it anywhere in the world. The point is, Norm knew that as a planet, we are not food secure. We're always one step ahead of famine. And that was a close call. So Caitlin mentioned some of the supply chain issues that introduced food insecurity within the United States. All right, the last Omicron surge exacerbated that still again. Okay, but I want to keep coming back and hammering this theme that we're not food secure as a planet. Yes, the war has made it worse, but we're not food secure as a planet. We're not food secure in Nevada. And I've shown a picture of a supermarket shelves in Reno in January of this year. Nevada ranks as the 8th most food insecure state in the US for its entire population. Among children, it's the 3rd most food insecure state. We're extremely vulnerable to supply chain interruptions without the pandemic. Fires, earthquakes, floods, landslides, and snow can quickly interrupt the food supply. As soon as they cut off I-80, we're in trouble, and we have 2 or 3 days of food, depending on how you calculate that. I've shown here using a new GRACE satellite of NASA, aquifer water supply in different parts of the world. About 2 billion, or a quarter of the population, use aquifers as a primary drinking water source, and groundwater accounts for roughly 1/3 of the world's water withdrawals. The highest rates of depletion are in the world's largest growing regions. I've worked in every one of those except for the Central Valley. This is unsustainable when you have that high percentage of the world depending upon unsustainable pumping of water. That should make everybody concerned. And as pointed out over and over again, when you have declines in that groundwater availability and they inject food insecurity, it triggers more civil uprising and international violent conflicts. And that's what we see in the already water-stressed regions of the world. Another trend we should be aware of that should make you feel food insecure. The cropland per person continues to decline dramatically. And I've shown that in the top slide where we're looking at in the blue irrigated land and in the green rain-fed land. But look at that, the slope of that line. And then the other thing is, when you look at the bottom line, it is the middle and low income who are proportionally much more dependent upon irrigation for food security. All right, irrigation, which is coming from those aquifers that are being unsustainably drawn down. So in the blue there, that's well-off people, most of us, the United States, and then the green is the middle and low income people. So climate change really is a threat to food security in the world, but especially projections are that climate change is going to be severest in those very areas I was talking about that already couldn't feed themselves because of lack of water, drought, and rapidly rising populations. So it's going to be worse as far as non-resilient countries, in other words, countries that aren't wealthy and as resilient as the United States or even Australia, in the Near East and the North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. And again, Caitlin touched on this to a certain extent, but when people are miserable or climate insecure or food insecure or water insecure, they move. And so the UN Security Council recognizes outmigration as a threat to peace and security, especially where ethnic and social tensions exist. And most of you should be able to think about all sorts of places in the world where that's occurring now. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change noted that the greatest single impact of climate change would be human migration. The most repeated prediction is 200 million people by 2050, which isn't that far away. And it's important to point out that there are inequities in this migration. And we know, for example, it won't be gender neutral because as a group, women tend to be poorer and less powerful than men. I'd like to give an example of how we managed to address climate change, looking at dryland wheat yield. Again, wheat's something I know about it, in the panhandle of Texas, where I worked for about 8 years. So in the top slide, we show temperature going up and rain going down. And that's over a period of 1949 to 1999. And if you look at yield of dryland wheat, which is the sort of magenta line, you can see that it parallels for the first 30 or 40 years rainfall, which is that blue line, all right? But then we started using modern genetics, modern forms of soil science and agronomy, and we discovered new things in crop sciences and how to use fertilizer more efficiency and how to manage pests better, et cetera. And so you see that despite the fact that we have higher temperatures and lower rainfall, if you look at that magenta line, yields continue to go up. But that took investment into research, public investment into research. Look how we've been doing as far as public investment into agriculture research as a country. We were the leaders in this as far as an individual country for many, many years. Beginning in about 2000, our investment stopped, or at least it plateaued. And then around 2010, it started to tank. And it's now the latest data are 2013, but it's essentially flat since then. Now look where China's line is. China surpassed us as a country as far as their investment into public agricultural research. And so now it dwarfs what we invest. India invests more, Brazil invests more, but we invest less. And for reasons I've pointed out, I think that's personally a very bad trend that needs to be reversed. Next, and this is my final slide, the next and final slide. So all of those things concern me, those trends that leave us food insecure. But the last one that I'm keenly aware of, because I'm a dean and I'm trying to train the next generation of agriculturalists, is we don't have enough young people going into agriculture. And that could be the private sector, farming itself, or the public sector. I'll just show and this is a study that was done by the Lieutenant Governor of Iowa and DuPont. If you look at the current supply divided by the demand, the best we're doing is 19% for other life sciences. And those are most of the people going into biotechnology. If you look at what we used to call ag engineering, now it's called ag bioengineering and everything else. If you round it off to single digits, 0%. My field, plant and soil science, 2%. So in addition to all the other trends that I'm concerned about, our lack of investment, or our divestment, I would say, into agriculture research, and even more frighteningly, the lack of young people willing to go in, not unwilling to go into what are really high-paying jobs, is concerning to me. So if I can sum up in one sentence, yes, the Ukraine war has made the world less food secure, but we were not food secure to begin with. And I think hopefully this last pandemic will wake up more and more people to that reality. Thank you.
Bill, thank you very much for that. And I think both of you hit on that point that you just ended with, Bill, brilliantly, which is don't take these issues and these impacts of one particular crisis out of context and only look at, oh my gosh, what's the war doing? If the situation was bad, the war has made it worse, but it didn't cause it. So I really appreciate that. So a couple questions for you, and I welcome the two of you to ask each other questions as well. But I'm going to start with you, Caitlin, on your discussion about what CSIS is doing to track the impacts of agricultural disruption in Ukraine. Could you talk to us more about what the projections are, as best you know them now, for what will happen? I mean, have the fields been, you mentioned the fields have been targeted, equipment had been targeted. What are the projections for the potential decline in production of wheat and oil seeds a year from now? Or do we not have those numbers yet?
We don't have those numbers yet. That's a great question, Maureen. The report that I mentioned, the World Agriculture Supply and Demand Estimates report that's put up by the USDA, doesn't yet treat the future harvest. The reports that have been put out so far treat grain that was harvested in the past, that's ready for export. I believe it's in May, so it's either this month's report that will have assessed April, or it's next month's report that will assess May, that will treat those questions about future harvests. Some estimates that I'm seeing, 20 to 30% reduction in harvests. And it's not just because of access to inputs. It's not just because farmers aren't able to access fertilizer because they don't have access to energy. Energy prices are high because electricity has been cut off. It's because as they return to fields, they find that in some places, Russian soldiers have placed landmines. So they have to hire consultants to scan their fields for landmines before they can resume agricultural activity. So there are going to be delays for a variety of reasons, but there's no one number yet that we can cite out of USDA or from UN Food and Agriculture Organization.
Excellent. Could you, in the past, we have heard the use of the phrase "don't use food as a weapon," and that's that may be a great bumper sticker, and it goes both ways, right? You know, Russia's basically targeting food in a weaponized sense to not only starve the world, but starve Ukraine, and on the other side are the sanctions. So how does how do the international entities, FAO and the UN, how do they view how we treat food as as in terms of conflict? What are the fundamental principles out there that international organizations agree to? Russia may be violating them, but what are the rules of the road in terms of food and conflict?
Yeah, when we talk about the use of food as a weapon of war, I think one case study could be Mariupol right now, where Russia is cutting off access to food in an effort to further torture, whatever verb you want to use, citizens of Mariupol, and to continue to put pressure on the Ukrainian government. I mean, they're using a variety of means, not just actual weapons, but lack of access to food, rape, other means to put pressure on, to again torture Ukrainian citizens and put pressure on the Ukrainian government. The Geneva Conventions prohibit targeting the agriculture sector in times of war. Russia, of course, isn't observing that. And then also in terms of global recognition of food, generally speaking, the UN Human Rights Convention grants recognizes a human right to food. We of course are a signatory to that convention, but when it comes to that particular right, the furthest the U.S. government has gone is recognition of the progressive realization of the right to food for a number of legalistic reasons. I don't know if thinking on that right to food has progressed in recent years, but to my knowledge, that's the furthest the U.S. has gone recognizing the global right to food.
Bill, actually, let me follow up with a question for you, and that's the issue about fear of GMO products and how that's impacting both world supply and maybe even climate adaptation for food supplies.
There's no doubt that it's affecting it negatively. Europe limits the amount of GMO food that it will import. Some of that might be philosophical, some might be marketplace competition. There are groups, particularly European-based, that try to prevent its spread in Africa, where these kinds of technologies are very much needed. India's had a great difficulty in accepting GMOs because of some activist groups, whereas they've been part of the American diet for quite some time. We're sort of moving away from GMOs and plant technology and going to gene editing techniques that we had hoped would be a little bit more palatable, for lack of a better term. But the hysteria that certain groups use to gin up fear among those who are not that scientifically learned is, to me, quite appalling. And I've seen some really awful instances of that. Zimbabwe is one where groups were lobbying them not to import BT corn and encouraging therefore starvation instead. And I could just tick off a long list of that. For the reasons I hope that I made abundantly clear, we have to grow more food with less water, less land, in a harsher climate. We have to go to the kinds of technologies that we've, since the days of Borlaug, we've resorted to innovate again, so that we can, we hope sustainably, produce enough food to feed a planet. And if indeed food is the right, and we have to sustain the planet, then the need is overwhelming. And so we're going to need to be able to avail ourselves of all kinds of technologies, but we also need the best and the brightest to go into the field of agriculture.
Excellent. Yes, that's a challenging topic, and I'm not sure many of the people understand the difference between GMOs and gene editing. So good luck with that education campaign. Caitlin, let's return back to Ukraine. We talked a little bit. You gave your best understanding, and I know there'll be more information on the infrastructure and the field disruption for the crops. But is there any studies on how the internal displacement of Ukrainians, either within Ukraine or out of the country, will affect the ability to produce agriculture? Because as Bill said, there's a shortage of people doing it in the United States. I would imagine in a war zone, that shortage has just gotten a whole lot worse.
Yeah, thanks, Maureen. Actually, I'll take your question in a slightly different way. The question wouldn't just be about people available to produce agricultural products, but for all aspects of agriculture. So to drive trucks to transport food, to staff warehouses, to staff markets, etc. So on the one hand, many people who are involved in agriculture are people who fall into the category of being between 18 and I forget if it's 50 or 60 years old, but men that the Ukrainian government is requiring to be available to for combat to defend Ukraine right now. So on the one hand, you see a reduction of labor for that reason. Again, from people who had been working on farms and all aspects of agricultural of food systems in Ukraine. On the other hand, you see a lot of farmers in Ukraine, farmers in particular, who are seeing their agricultural activity as an expression of their nationalistic pride, that it's my duty to continue this activity, despite the fact that Russians have placed landmines in my fields, because I need to feed my country. So I'm also seeing reports of that there's a lot of pride and that people are very intent on continuing to produce agricultural products for that reason. I'll also mention too that Ukraine has relied on migrant labor to a certain extent for their own agriculture sector. And of course, as the war continues, laborers are looking to other countries that are more stable to provide their labor there. So a lot of reasons that the war is disrupting agricultural activity and availability of labor across food systems in the country.
Excellent. That's really insightful, and I hadn't realized they were also dependent on imported labor as well. Is there an exemption for those who are in the agriculture business from mandatory service in the Ukrainian military right now? Do you know?
Actually, thanks for bringing that up. I think that there is, or recently was put in place. I think that could be the case. Yeah.
Excellent. So I'm gonna address a question to both of you from your different perspectives. Let's just to say a miracle occurs tomorrow. There's a peace treaty and the war ends. What's the tail of the impact on food security from the disruption that's happened now? Rather than asking you how long is this going to go on, because we don't know how long the war is going on, if we had this massive disruption that took place and it went on for, whatever it is now, 3 months, and it stopped tomorrow, how long would the tail of impact to food security be felt? I'll start with you,
Bill,
Caitlin.
Great. Yeah, I'll start. Then Bill, look forward to hearing from you. I'll take this in two parts. The first part is looking at Ukraine. It's hard to put a timeline on it, but it's not going to be immediate because you would need a return of labor to fields for those who've left. You need a return of labor to all other aspects of food systems. You need a rebuilding of all of the infrastructure that's been targeted, as I mentioned, from fields, bridges, railroads, ports, silos, warehouses, etc. All of that infrastructure would need to be repaired. You need a stabilization of prices of inputs, energy, fertilizer, access to irrigation, etc. So I expect that would take months, probably looking into years. And Ukraine, as Bill mentioned, was one of the top 5, top 6 exporters of grains. So a long time to get up to the point that to get to their previous point. And then I'll look at Russia also. So even if the war were to end, sanctions aren't going to be lifted because Russia's, just because they might stop this and this invasion doesn't mean that they'll be accepted and embraced on back into the global economy, back into global multilateral discussions, etc. So I think that they will continue to be sanctioned And again, doesn't mean that their agriculture sector will be sanctioned, but sanctions on their financial sector will affect exports from Russia. So I think that continued sanctions on Russia are going to continue to have an effect. So lingering effects both on Ukraine and on Russia for a variety of reasons. All that to say that the sooner that it ends, the better it is for agriculture markets and food security around the world. But just because it could end tomorrow doesn't mean that effects would end tomorrow.
Understood. Thank you, Caitlin. Bill, from your perspective, same question.
Well, I think somewhat similar for different reasons, but somewhat similar to the last global recession. It'll take a few years for things to sort themselves out, and how they sort themselves out I don't think we know exactly. You could imagine other countries, Canada, for example, responded by increasing their wheat production. China could do the same. A number of countries could increase. As I was just showing, people change their diets. So if wheat becomes too expensive or too rare, they might switch back to rice or another more locally traditional crop. But again, I think it will take a while to sort itself out. Nothing devastates a country's ability to produce its own food more than war. And I've seen that in one country after another. There's nothing that brings about more poverty, and there's nothing that just destroys so many systems, some of which have been in place for centuries, so that people just don't have the wherewithal to produce food again. So I would suspect that because of its size, some sort of a Marshall Plan is going to be needed for the Ukraine. But I want to come back to whether it's climate change or price shocks, whatever, it's the poor and these vulnerable countries that are going to suffer most. I tried to make the argument, we learned this in the Netherlands, after they were invaded by Germany and were so poor. That's when we first discovered epigenetics, that the grandchildren were suffering things that were traumatized from their starving parents who were eating bark off of trees. And so I'm just concerned that we're setting afloat another generation in Africa and other vulnerable countries that will have enduring effects.
Wow. Yeah, that's important to realize that it isn't just the immediate impacts, but also the what we pass on genetically into the next generations. And that's rather sobering. Bill, while you're here, I'm going to ask you another question. You gave some descriptions about how different countries have invested in or not, or curtailed their investments in agricultural research. Are international organizations picking up any of the slack there? Are they making investments in agricultural research, or is that solely the responsibility of nation states?
Well, it's usually for those international research institutes like the kind that I've worked for, it's usually nation states that fund them, but every nation state has its own politics. And so somebody was asking about ICRISAT. ICRISAT is doing fair to middle, and that's based in India. ICARDA, where I worked for before I came here, which was based in Aleppo, to give you an idea of how well it's doing. I mean, because of the countries it has to deal with, it's difficult for other economies such as the United States to invest in it. So the United States did not want to see any of its dollars going into Iran, for example, but it's one of those countries that is facing all these problems that we're talking about. So we need to find a way around that. And rich Arab states have never funded ICARDA to the extent that it needed to be funded. The United States has always been a champion of funding CIMMYT, which is for rice and maize, and IRRI, based in the Philippines, for rice. So it's complicated. And then the other thing is, when I first started out at this international research center, ICRISAT, the focus was on research. They wanted the best research, the most impactful research, and it worked. It worked particularly for wheat and rice. And now more and more nation states want them to focus on development. And so they might take on a number of good causes, women's rights and the like. but you're diluting, in my view, you're diluting the purpose of what was a purely research-focused institute, and you're now sort of occurring mission drift so that there's overlap with other NGOs and that might be a better place to do that kind of work.
Excellent. Yeah, agriculture often gets blended in with so many other things. It doesn't become the focus. So I'm going to also close now with a question for each of you, which is step back in history and give us some ideas of how we can learn from things that have happened in the past and better anticipate. So we understand that we're in a situation that is dire, not just driven by the war, driven by a lot of other factors. But there, Bill, you were great in capturing, the Green Revolution things. What can we learn from what either Ukraine has gone through, because they've been fought over for centuries, and a lot because of their ability to produce food? What can we learn from historical events? How do we combine that together? And then if you had your druthers, what are some of the actions that we could take now to mitigate the crisis that we seem to either be in or falling off the cliff into? So Bill, I'll start with you since you're here.
Oh boy, that's a question for the ages. I think that we and advanced nations need to recognize the challenges we face, and also that they are not hermetically sealed. Miserable people move. They always have, and that's another lesson from history. The other thing that I wish that we as a nation would be better at is, to follow on your point, is to learn the cultural context before we intervene in an area, because that context might have been there for centuries, and it might be something you can't understand in 30 minutes from a YouTube or a TikTok video. That there might be, and this is one of the things that the United Nations Security Council was pointing out too. If you have people who are out migrating, but there are ethnic or religious conflicts, it makes things that much worse. And one should understand that before one intervenes in another society. And I've seen that so not to become political, I've seen that in Iraq and how that spilled over into a region, because I don't think we understood what we were sort of setting ablaze. And I saw it in Libya too, where that sort of spread out to sub-Saharan Africa. And so we need to understand those contexts better before we start intervening.
Excellent. Thank you, Bill. And perhaps you're stressing the interconnectedness of these issues. Don't just think you can go in and do something without the having it dovetail or spiral out into the rest of the world. So Caitlin, I'm going to give you the last word on that kind of perspective. What are the things that you're looking for? What are the things that we can learn from, and what are the actions that you think we can do to mitigate this crisis?
Sure. Thank you. Thanks for that question, Maureen. And I like what Bill said. It's a question for the ages, because really all throughout time in every region of the world, it's been a concern how to secure food supplies for populations. So what I'll do is I actually want to point to the 2015 Intelligence Community Assessment on Global Food Security. It's the only time the entire intelligence community did an assessment on impacts of global food security on U.S. national security. And one thing that they said at the time was that large exportable supplies of key components of food production, such as phosphates, potash, and fuel oil, come from states where conflict or government actions could cause supply chain disruptions that lead to price spikes. So we've had this insight for a while. It's one of those things where just because the intelligence community noted that it could happen doesn't mean that we thought that it would happen. But regardless, it's only 7 years ago that the IC told us that conflict in strategic adversaries to the United States could affect food prices around the world, including in the United States. So all this to say that we've known that climate change is affecting food production around the world. Conflicts like this conflict is having an effect on food prices around the world. What we know is that these disruptions will continue to happen. It was just COVID 2 years ago that caused the last major disruption in food security, which could have caused the highest level of food insecurity in the last 15 years. So climate change, pandemics, wars, et cetera, these disruptions will continue to happen. And one thing that I think is important is that as the world looks to solutions to the food security impacts of this present war, I think it'd be wise to put in place solutions that are going to have staying power. And for example, one thing that I've seen considered is from the UNFAO, they're calling it a food import financing facility. So it's a facility that would help countries that rely on production from Ukraine and Russia to meet their own food needs. A number of countries around the world rely on imports from those two countries to meet their food security needs. So something like that to me makes good sense, because there are going to continue to be shocks, not shocks like this one to global food supplies. Again, related to war, related to climate change, related to pandemics, et cetera, and something that can have staying power to help food importing countries withstand the effects of future shocks would be really wise.
Excellent. Thank you, Caitlin. And I appreciate you mentioning that report. For those of you who are looking at the chat box, I just put a link to that 2015 report in the chat box, and I will send it out to the group afterwards, post on our resource page shortly. So with that, thank you very much, Caitlin and Bill, for your insights. I appreciate you sharing with our group and with the students in the Washoe County School District who will be watching this program in the coming weeks. And I look forward to hearing from you. If you have any other resources or thoughts in the future, please let me know, and I will pass it on to the NSF community. So with that, NSFers, take care, be safe, and we will see you again in a couple weeks. Thank you.